basically, we as meteorologists are wanting to get our message out. And we've been in the habit of just kind of pushing a button and letting it go and hoping that people understand what we're doing. But many times what we expect people to do and we expect them to react based on a message that we send out, they don't do it or they don't understand it. So I've asked Dr. Laura Myers to come on and speak to us about clear messaging with social media, and more like clear messaging with the Weather Enterprise in general. I met Dr. Laura, I don't know if it was an AMS conference or an NWA conference several years ago, and she has consistently provided talks to the Weather Enterprise on messaging and how to get our information out in a clear and concise way. Dr. Myers currently is a research scientist and deputy director for the Center for Advanced Public Safety at the University of Alabama. She holds a doctorate in criminology, which I didn't know, and we'll have to talk about that offline sometime, from Florida State University. She's received numerous grants to help develop models for regional emergency planning with emphasis on social science aspects of partnership planning between the National Weather Service and our enterprise partners, which of course includes emergency management, broadcast meteorologists, and other end users. So, without further ado, I turn things over to Dr. Myers to talk about clear messaging in social media. So I will hand this over to you, so you now have control.
Oh my gosh.
Just one quick reminder, be sure to put your phones on mute once you get logged in here. And again, like I said, if you want to carry on the conversation on Twitter, be sure to use the NWS Think Social hashtag. All right, Dr. Myers.
All right, can everybody see?
Looks good.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay. Let me get the whole panel out of our way here. Okay, as Tim said, we're going to talk about clear messaging in social media. And what I'm going to do here is really talk a lot about the different ways we can communicate through social media and really focus on communication processes. Okay. Having a little bit of technical problem. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the mission for what we want to do today. Basically, when Tim asked me to talk about this discussion, we were talking about the fact that when we try to push information across social media, all of us have the tendency to use whatever our disciplinary jargon is and the science behind our work as part of our messaging process. And, of course, our jargon and our science speak are problematic to our audiences because they don't necessarily understand the terminology that we're using. And because of that, in social media, we may be missing the opportunity to create the message that we want. So what we're going to do today is discuss how to use social media to clearly and concisely speak a message to get people to take action. And in doing so, we're going to talk about the theories behind social media messaging. And not just the theories behind it, but the processes that are developed from those theories. Okay, let's talk about social media strategy. And that's the first step in this process. When we're talking about communicating weather impacts via social media, it's a process. And that's what I'm going to explain today is that process. And it's a very simple process in and of itself. And that simple process is to simplify communication. And so what you got to remember is that complexity confuses people. And so we got to talk about what complexity is so that we understand how we can simplify that process. So when we're talking about complexity, it's when we're using high-level words, when we're using scientific words, words that we understand but the public doesn't necessarily understand. But it's not just the words. It's how we use the words. It's also how we visually portray what we're talking about. We can provide too much information. We can be too wordy. We can really not put the focus on what we're trying to say at the right part of the message. So we've got to figure out what are the rules of communication that help us make it simple, make it clear, and get our points across. So that's what we're trying to do, is reduce that complexity of communication. So let's look at the process. To really understand the process of communicating in social media, and this process is true for anybody trying to do this. So it's not just those folks in the Weather Enterprise trying to do this, but it's for anybody trying to officially communicate information through social media. And that beginning of that process is to develop your objectives. What is it you're trying to do? What are you trying to achieve by pushing messaging out through social media? You also have to analyze what platforms you're using, because your messaging will be different depending on the platforms. So in some places you have more opportunity to communicate than others. Twitter you don't have as much. Facebook you have more. You have to figure out the timing in terms of when do people get Twitter, when do they get Facebook, and then all the other forms of social media that we might use. So you have to start looking at those things. What are you trying to do? Where are you trying to do it? How are you trying to communicate? Because if you establish those objectives, then you'll be able to connect your messages to your objectives. So let me give you a few examples. If you're trying to communicate warning information through social media, then you've got to choose social media platforms that are going to get that information out immediately, and it's got to be concise and it's got to be clear. You may be trying to get information out that educates the public in advance of severe weather. So you're engaging in risk communication, in which you're trying to educate the public about risk, trying to get them to be more prepared and get them ready when the crisis communication comes through in social media. So there's a lot of different objectives, a lot of different things that you may be trying to accomplish. So that's one of the first things that you want to do, is establish what it is you're trying to do and how you're going to do it. Now, in terms of the messaging itself, regardless of what your objectives are, your messaging has to be organic and relevant, and the public knows when it's not relevant. If they don't see it's useful to them, if they think it's over their head or it doesn't make any sense to them, then they don't get the message and they don't follow the information you're trying to push out. So you have to develop a voice in social media. And when I talk about voice, people listen for a certain persona in the people they follow, the people they trust, the people they listen to. And the best way to really illustrate this is to think about broadcast meteorologists. They have a voice. They have a persona with their audiences. Their audiences know them. They know the nature of the messaging that the broadcast meteorologist is trying to put out. So in social media, you're trying to do the same thing. You're trying to create that same persona through a technological medium where you can only use words and some visualization to try to create that persona that the public comes to rely on. So because of that, you want to steer clear of any prepackaged messaging whenever you possibly can. And of course, in social media, you could use prepacked messaging. But when you do that, your public will know. They'll know that it's not sincere. And of course, it has the potential to desensitize your public because they feel like you're just pushing out something that you pushed a button to release. And so they don't really feel like you're connected to them. They don't feel like talking to them. So that becomes problematic. Now, of course, timing is an issue. You may not have enough time to develop your own content, but sometimes you do. Most of the time you will. And when you don't have time, the public will accept the prepackaged messaging. So let's talk about that trust and establishing that trust so that your audience receives the messaging you're trying to put out. If the audience is already engaged with you, they believe you're worthy of their trust. And they believe in the Weather Service. They believe in their meteorologists. And so that engagement is already there. They do trust you. But there's more than trust. You have to earn their faith. They're willing to go to look for the information. They're willing to follow you. They're willing to friend you. They're willing to take that information in. But then they're looking at it in terms of, is it useful to them? Have they found it useful? Can they rely on it? Is it consistent for them? So that's how you earn their faith. And earning that faith is a result of three things: the content that you push out, the expression with which you push it out, and listening carefully to feedback from your audiences about what it is you've pushed out. So it's a three-pronged approach, and we're going to look at that content, we're going to look at expression, and we're going to look at that feedback process of listening to our audiences to help us understand how to better craft our messages. Now, let's go back to the process for a minute. The process goes to intent. What is your goal with pushing information out through social media? Are you trying to warn? Are you trying to advise? Are you trying to inspire, amaze, give, unite, amuse? Those are all common goals in social media. And you notice I have the cartoon here. You better get out of the sun, Ralph. Looks like you're done. I give you that one to illustrate the amusing point of all of this, because we don't want to just use social media for the warning process. We want to engage in a lot of activities with our audience to help educate them about what's going on. So in risk communication, in advance of actual warning information, we want to capture their attention. We want to make points. We want to advise them. We want to, capture that attention in a way that they recall the information later when they need it. So it may be that you're trying to amuse them with a cartoon, but that cartoon gets across a point. And so this cartoon here, of course, would be illustrative of, heat, sun, exposure, that type of information. So you have to be very creative in the ways that you put messaging together to go along with the intent of your messaging. If you're trying to warn, of course, it's much more serious. It has to be very concise, and it has to get the point across quickly. If you're trying to advise people, it's going to involve more content, and it's got to be, how to, what you expect. If you're trying to inspire people to prepare, if you're trying to inspire people to be more weather aware, then there's a lot of different ways to do that. So all of these have different methods and approaches depending on what your intent is. And as a messenger, you're going to engage in all of these intentions at some point in time using social media. Now, an added aspect of this process is you're not just trying to get that information directly to your audience. You're also expecting your audience to share those messages. And so part of the content of your messaging has to be geared toward getting them to disseminate it further than just themselves, because that's how we can enhance the warning dissemination process and the education dissemination process. So in your content, what they've done is analyze in people's content what gets people to share more often. So if we use the word please, or how to, or help, or we use the word directly you, or follow, or if we use the word critical, or if we use any type of scientific terms, it is geared toward getting people to share more. So we know that those kind of words, those kind of things, capture people's attention and make them want to share. And that's a psychology of sharing. And that's a goal that should be part of what you're doing when you're framing your content, is what kind of wording would capture their attention that would cause them to share that information with others. Now, keep these words in mind as we go along, because as we start talking about actual content, you can see how you would ask them to please do something, or you would give them a how-to, or you would use certain words. Now, part of this, of course, when we're talking about scientific terminology, is it can be too elevated. And we're going to talk about that in terms of how do we simplify scientific terminology so that even though it is science and it captures their attention and they want to share it, it's simple enough for everybody to understand. What you're trying to do, of course, is to engage the brain. And that goes to the issue of trying to reduce scientific terminology to something simple enough for the layperson to understand. And so one of the things that you want to do is simplify your content to the level of a fifth grader. And you probably wonder, well, what is the level of a fifth grader? And if you want to know that, you need to find a fifth grade school textbook. And you'll see the terminology that's used in that textbook. And everybody in education is taught that everything should be taught at a fifth grade level. Because beyond a fifth grade level, we start getting into terminology that is disciplinary, it is narrow, it is hard for people to follow. And so we want to keep it at that simplified level. And I'll give you some examples of that kind of terminology as we go along. We also want to engage the brain by creating motion. It's not just enough to put words into something and hope people understand it, but we want to actually capture their eyes when we're putting messaging across. So if there's any way to add motion to our messages, and I'm going to show you in a minute how we can do that, you want to create something that captures it. Think about it yourself. If you're going through your Twitter feed or you're going through your Facebook feed and something is moving in the feed, you'll stop and look at it. So adding motion to it is critical. And then finally, in terms of engaging the brain, we've got to find common ground with our audience. What do they care about? What is it? Where is it? What time will it be here? How bad is it? Can it harm me? That's what they care about. So if we're going to engage the brain, we want to make sure we understand what their needs are. All right, so here's an example. This is a visualization in a tweet from the Birmingham Weather Service office. And I want you to look at some of the factors here in terms of complexity versus simplicity, wording, and also the motion that we're talking about. Notice that there are very few words here. There's a lot of coloring here. There's words used to capture your attention. The word severe is in red. The word in the message is confidence is increasing for severe weather late Monday, early Tuesday. Please see the graphic for the latest info. So you can see some of the terms that I mentioned. It's referring them to additional information. It's telling them the threats, the impacts of things that are to come. It's giving the timing of information. It also is using the word threat, which is very critical in the warning process. So using the word threat is very helpful. Notice the arrow that indicates motion. This one is not moving, but it's indicating motion just by using the arrow that says motion. So we're telling people in what direction something is happening. So there's a lot of information to convey here, but we've simplified it into one shot for people to get as much information as possible, but to keep it as simple as possible. So really it gets down to what we call social media psychology. We got to think about what appeals to others, not what appeals to us. We know in our messaging what it is we're trying to get across, and we understand it better than anybody else. So we've got to turn that around and figure out how we express it in a way that appeals to the masses. And when I say the masses, not everybody is going to understand it in the same way. So how do you craft a message? How do you make it clear so that the most people have the greatest opportunity to understand? And again, it comes back to that trust. I want you to think about who you trust for information. When people trust you, they understand that you're going to do the best you can to simplify that message, that you're going to get the information out the best way you can. And they're going to understand that we make mistakes in that process. So you won't ever be perfect at this, and you will make mistakes from time to time. But it's really the effort of trying to simplify and reach our audience. So let's talk about that simplification process. When we're trying to simplify, doing something called following the law of Prägnanz. The law of Prägnanz is to make it simple. We want to simplify patterns, order, and our ideas. So here's an example of trying to simplify by using patterns and order. And it's the logo for the Olympics. Take a look at this. When you look at this, what do you see? You see the logo for the Olympics, and you also see 5 circles, different colors. Anytime you see that, you probably know what it is. But look how simple it is. Look how ordered it is. Look at the pattern in this mess brand. So that's one of the first things to think about is, are there patterns? Is there order? What kind of rules of simplification can you use to simplify your message? Another rule to simplify is to keep it linear. It's called the law of continuity. You want to visually align your message. The example is 2 cross lines. We see 2 cross lines. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. And when you think about that, think about the visualization that you would put into your messaging. This is lightning strikes. See the little X that indicate the lightning strikes. See how simple it is. Shows location. Shows the message that we're trying to convey. And so things like that appeal to our brain. We understand it. We get the idea we're supposed to be focusing on something in a certain location, and that's what our focus should be. So here's another example in terms of linearity. I want you to look at this visualization from left to right. You see how the weather is moving left to right. You see the lines. Those are timing lines. So the first one is until 9 o'clock, then 8 p.m. to 12 a.m., 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. See the order? See the linearity in that process. The color is also part of that. So all of that is critical in terms of getting as much information across as possible, but keeping it simple. Because, again, what is our intent? We're trying to advise about the timing. We're trying to advise about the onset, when it's going to end. We're trying to advise about the severity. So that's all part of that linearity. We're trying to get people to move across that visualization from left to right, figure out where they are in that visualization, and understand our message. Another law to follow is the law of similarity. We want to use similar colors, shapes, and sizes. We want to create relationships or groups in our messaging. Now, I'll give you this to look at. Look at all these pictures. If you look at each one of the objects and look at all the shapes within them, the shapes within each of the shapes are the same size, the same type of shape. So we've got triangles, we've got rectangles, and you see how it's visually appealing to see the order in something like this. So let's take a look at a weather map. This is a pretty complex weather map in terms of how much information is here. But if we're posting this in social media for people to look at, there are some simple messages here. First of all, you can see with color coding exactly where things are. You can see where it wants to capture our attention. We can also see just by using the mapping alone that we can visually figure out where we are in relation to all of this additional information. So a lot of the graphics that we might use in our social media, you want to look at them in terms of, do they convey the message as simply as possible? Would the general public be able to look at this and get the message that you're trying to get across? Now, that's all about visualization. That's all about trying to put some of the simple information together. So now I want to talk about the wording that we use in our messages. And this really gets to simplifying the jargon and simplifying the wording, the scientific terminology that we use. And this goes to something called prototype theory. Essentially, when humans try to understand something, we place things in what we call category buckets. Category buckets are trying to classify information. We want to know what something is by what it is not. What we're doing is giving an examination of anything that we're looking at, a yes or no. It is or it isn't. So a dog is a dog, but a dog is not a cat. Okay? A cat is a cat, but it's not a dog. How do we classify or categorize dog versus cat? Now, well, the reason that's important is that's the way we learn. That's how we're taught as kids. The vocabulary and language that we use. That's how we acquire the knowledge that we're exposed to as young children. We're given all of these classifications and categories, and that's what we spend many of our early years in education doing, is establishing those category buckets so that as we grow developmentally and we get more complex information, we still attempt to classify it in those category buckets. Now, of course, the problem is that there's cultural or regional variations in those categories. And so when we start to talk about terminology that we use, it can vary from location to location. So when we start talking about the words that we use, the content that we use, you've got to customize it for the cultural or regional variation of the audience that you're trying to reach, because the wording you use in the Southeast may be very different from what you use in the Northwest. And so you've got to look at that and be aware of that variation. So here's an example, and I think this is the most hilarious variation because being from the South, it's all Coke to me. And when somebody says soda or pop, I'm just like, what are they talking about? I was in Oklahoma City last week, and I was listening to a law enforcement officer talk about the pop that they had provided for this meeting. And I was like, really? Pop? And so you understand that the same thing can be defined by different words. So for me, Coke, everything is Coke. Sprite is Coke. Dr. Pepper is Coke. Everything is Coke. For people who use the word pop or soda, everything falls under that category. So what you got to do is when you're developing the wording that you're using, you've got to think about the prototype. What are the methods of identifying typical members of a category? And what you're doing is you're basing it on the most frequently associated terms associated with that category. Now, to understand that, let's give an example. If I say, okay, let's use the category domicile. What are particular domiciles? A house, an apartment, a condo. Well, it means different things to different people. It depends on where they live, what their experiences are. I mean, I come from a place, I grew up with a place that didn't have apartments. I didn't know what an apartment was, much less what a condo was. So when you say domicile, to me, I would probably first think of a house. Now, how does that relate to weather information? Let's say that we're messaging and we're telling people to take shelter. What is a shelter? Shelter is a big, broad category. And shelter means different things to different people. Do we mean an in-ground shelter, a house, an above-ground shelter, a car, under a roof? What does it mean? We know from the research that we've done with the public after severe weather events, when we've asked them about taking shelter and what they did, they tell us all kinds of things. They say, I thought you meant just get inside the house or get under, some kind of a roof. So it really depends on what people's understanding of the word is. Here's another example. When we tell people to get into a shelter, here are two examples of an above-ground shelter. This is a shelter in the Moore, Oklahoma tornadoes in 2013. This was an above-ground shelter in a garage. And if you see the structure that's remaining to the right of that, that's also the remains of a home, and that's also where someone's sheltered. So, and everybody survived in both locations. In the house that crumbled around them, the little area that they were in, they sheltered in that, and they survived. The people who got into this reinforced above-ground shelter, they also survived. So when we tell people to take shelter, what does that necessarily mean? Are they going to the safest places? Are they going to the best places? Or do they even understand what a shelter means? So given that, you got to think about response time, priming, and exemplars of categories. You got to think about prototypical terms versus non-prototypical terms. Now, to do this, think of the game Pictionary. In Pictionary, you give people a category, and then they're supposed to come up with the examples of that category and try to figure out what that category is. If I say something like furniture, what are the examples of furniture? What comes to mind first in people's mind? Is it a couch? Is it a chair? Is it an armoire? What is it? And what we want to do is focus on the most common terms. We don't want to get into real unique ones. We also want to prime people for the category. So if we're saying shelter, instead of going with shelter, we probably want to use some of the more primed categories. We would want to say, a reinforced structure like a house or a building, as opposed to saying seek shelter. Or if we're saying seek shelter, we want to add some of those examples. And those are your exemplars. You want to, add examples that most of your audience will resonate with, that they would think of when you say shelter. And the only way to know that for your audience is to ask them. And that means getting to know your population. What kind of terminology is most common to them for the certain things that you would be putting into that messaging? And this also gets to the issue of impacts. If you're going to put impacts into your messaging, you're going to talk about the impacts of weather, then you got to use impacts that people understand. For example, if you're talking about tornadoes and the impacts of tornadoes and you start talking about what it'll do to a structure, you got to think about the structures that people live in. In certain locations, a lot of people live in mobile homes. So you're going to want to reference the impacts for particularly mobile homes, and that's going to be a high priority in your message because they're the most vulnerable. So you got to think about what those examples are, what the potential impacts are, and make them relevant to your audience and get it into that message. Now here's another example of the category issue. And I use this just to reinforce this idea that you got to think of the right words. This is called the Pepsi paradox. This goes back to the Coke and Pepsi wars several decades ago, actually now. I'm getting old. And in this particular example, they were taste testing Pepsi versus Coke to say which tastes better. And even though it turned out that the public felt like Pepsi tasted better, they referred to Coke as the better of the two brands. You got to ask yourself, well, why would Coke be better if Pepsi if it tastes better? Well, Coke was better to them because that's the brand they knew. That was the category they knew the best. So everything was referenced against Coke. And so that's what you got to think of. What are people referencing? What are people thinking of? What has the most influence on the minds of your audience when you're picking terminology to use? So what it really comes down to is what we call identity. You want to associate identity of something with a core set of categories to reinforce that linkage. So you got to think about the categories of things that are going to be in your common messaging. What are the categories of impacts? All right, so if we're talking about the impacts of a snow event or a severe thunderstorm event or a hail event, what are the 3 or 4 common impacts that are most common to your audience? If you're talking about precipitation types, what's the terminology categories for precipitation that your audience is going to understand? Remember, when you're talking about tornadoes or snow or wind, there are certain things that they're familiar with that are most common to them. And so if we start using words like derecho or graupel, then they're not going to know what we're talking about. So we got to think about the terminology for precipitation in terms of what we know that they understand. Time is also important. That's part of the categories we want to go in. And so what categories of time are most relevant? Is it the actual time? Is it day, night, afternoon? What are the terminologies of time that are most relevant to your audiences in trying to get that into your message? What about location categories? Is it north, south, east, west? Is it certain landmarks? What are the location categories that your public is going to understand? And then finally, what are the specific terms that are going to be most relevant to them? Now, some of the terminology that you're going to put in your messaging are things like watch, warning, advisory, severe, damaging. And we know from a lot of the research of the public after these severe weather events that even these words that are so common to the weather enterprise, there's a lack of understanding amongst the public. This is a result from a study we did in Atlanta, Birmingham, and Tuscaloosa last year after the January 28th winter weather event, the very strange one we had where the precipitation froze on the ground and everybody was at school and work and had to get in. And so one of the things that we did after that event was to survey the public and ask them if they understood warnings, watches, and advisories and what they were. And 89% understand a warning, 60% a watch, and 41% an advisory. And in fact, a lot of people thought an advisory was a downgrade from a watch. So even when we use terminology that we think the public understands, they don't necessarily. So when you give a warning or a watch or an advisory, you may have to give a little bit of an explanation so that they understand. So if an advisory is an upgrade, you need to say that it's an upgrade. Now, I mentioned the issue of impacts. How do we define impacts for people? Well, what kind of terminology do people understand? They understand things like power outages. The roads are impassable. There's ice on roadways, power lines, trees. If we're trying to get schools to make a decision about whether they're going to school or not, if you say ice on roadways, power lines, or trees, they get it, and they get it fast. So that's part of your goal, is trying to figure out how do I put those impacts in as brief a form as possible, but get the attention of the right decision makers. So if your intent is to get people to stay home and stay off the roads, what kind of terminology would you put in there? Things like heavy trucks will have no traction, roofs incapable of holding snow weight, travel impossible. Those are all very simple statements. They're direct impacts, and people understand those messages.
How will it result in your untimely demise?
You also want to look at the terminology in terms of including trigger words. There are certain words in weather that capture people's attention, and this is the kind of information you want to get in the front of your message. Things like heavy snow, cold, freezing temperatures, heavy flooding, mudslides, ice storm, tornadoes possible, hurricane-force winds. So one of the things that I suggest to you is thinking about the other trigger words that you think would get your audience's attention as quickly as possible. We've done a lot of research to study the warning messaging that's put out in social media as well as our other warning modalities to see what words capture the public's attention, also how long it takes to get to those words in a message. And so the more these are embedded further down in your message, the less likely they are to be caught or seen. They're going to ignore the message and go on. So you want to get those trigger words on the front end. You want to capture their attention as quickly as possible. You also want to include timing of the onset of the event. And when you think about timing, you're probably thinking about whatever timing information you have, but what captures the public's attention? They want a range of time. You notice the graphic I gave earlier gave ranges of time. People want to know the front end and the back end of a range of time. When should it get here? When should it leave? When is it going to be moving through my area? What is the timing and location? So not just when, but also where. Because I want to know where I am relative to what you're telling me in that message about where it's going to be and when it's going to be, because that helps me use that information better. And end time is important as start time. We get a lot of complaints from the public that we're pushing a lot of good messaging out, but you're not telling us when it's over. When is the tornado warning over? When is the polygon, been canceled? When am I out of the warning? When is the watch over? They want to know the end time as much as they want to know the start time. And that could be in a different message. But knowing that that information is needed is really important. Now, I told you a while ago that there's words that confuse the public, some that mean more to them than others. And so I want to give you some examples in terms of thinking about what do they mean. This GROPL term, I've seen a lot of jokes about GROPL and what it is. I was in an integrated warning team meeting yesterday in Atlanta, and we were talking about sleet and snow and GROPL and what the public understands. And, of course, some of these words make no sense to a majority of the public, like a derecho. After the derecho in 2012, then we started talking more about derechos. I'd never heard of a derecho up to 2012. And so the public is getting more familiar with terminology, but not necessarily. What is black ice? We can tell people there's going to be black ice, but I can tell you the general public doesn't have any clue what black ice is. Freezing rain. What is freezing rain? Is it going to freeze to the trees? Is it going to freeze to the power lines? Is it going to freeze to the road, the grass? That's confusing. What's a heat advisory? What does that mean to the public? What does that mean to the average person? What does that mean to somebody that doesn't have air conditioning? What's a winter weather advisory? We've done a lot of research in the past year on the fact that the public doesn't understand what a winter weather advisory is. What's a severe thunderstorm? In the 2012 derecho event, one of the things that we learned is that people don't take severe thunderstorm warnings very seriously because their perception of a severe thunderstorm is they happen all the time. So there are perceptions of severity that go along with this terminology that may not be what we're intending to convey. So if you're saying severe thunderstorm, you may have to talk about straight line winds to get them to understand that the wind in a thunderstorm could be just as strong as a tornado. I can tell you the public has no clue what a storm surge is. And so when we start talking about storm surges with hurricanes, they're thinking about winds. They're not talking about storm surge. So we're going to have to include wording that explains what a storm surge is. And what about a squall line? The general public doesn't understand what a squall line is, and especially why they don't want to be in the middle of a squall line. So we've got to explain the power of a squall line and what a squall line is and what it's doing so that they understand why we're trying to convey that information.
Wow.
We also want to be descriptive in our messaging. When we're trying to get information out, we can use things to say such things as this is a historic event. That's very descriptive. That tells us that, this could be catastrophic. This is something we've never seen before. It's going to have historical significance. We're trying to describe this may be bigger or worse or more widespread than something than we've ever seen before. Trying to convey that in very short terminology. We can say that the values that we're looking at are the highest we've personally ever seen, that the values are off the chart. At the same time, when you're trying to be descriptive, you want to avoid hype. And there's a lot of discussion out there about social media content and weather that is criticized as being hype. And so, professionally, that's what you want to do, is you want to make sure you're describing, but you're not exaggerating. You're not going over the line. You're not trying to capture too much attention, because we don't want the public to panic. We don't want the public to feel like they're unprepared because we've overhyped the description in our content. So it's a very careful process. Now, let me tell you about some of the terminology problems you're going to have in your content. When we're pushing this messaging out, who are we pushing it to? The assumption is that people we're pushing the messaging to are going to be able to take action. Some of the people that are getting that are not, though. They're not able to take action. They're vulnerable populations. They may not be able to transport themselves away, or they may not be able to seek shelter. So how do we message such that we're also reaching the vulnerable populations? Like, you're going to need assistance, or you're going to need somebody to help you. So we want to make sure that we understand that the messaging that we use is not just for the capable, but those who may be vulnerable and not as capable of doing what we expect them to do. Also, when you push your messaging out, there are language barriers. Your audience may not speak English as a primary language. It may be a secondary language, or they may not speak English at all. One of the things that we've done after several service assessments is make recommendations about translating social media messages into other common languages in our communities to make sure that messaging is getting across in the languages that our communities speak. And that's not always easy because this information does not translate easily. So you want to get those translations done long before you use them so that you can make sure that you've got the right messaging and the right wording. It's also important to know that terminology is problematic because some groups are impacted more than others. Like I mentioned, mobile home residents. So when you're messaging, you want to think about those who will be impacted more and tailor your messaging to reach those that will be impacted more. So to reference things like people who are outside, people who are at sporting events. You may want to include language that captures their attention because they're the ones more directly in the line of whatever you're warning about. Also realize that when you're messaging, mental health issues can be exacerbated by this. And so when you're putting this information out there, be aware that it could cause people to panic. It could cause people to get very excited. So you want to keep it as clear and straight as possible. You want to be descriptive, but you don't want to overhype it. So you want to be really careful in terms of how your audience might receive this information because people come to it with different psychologies, different psychoses, and because of that, they react differently to that terminology. And then finally, our terminology can be misinterpreted by cultural issues. Different cultures perceive things in different ways. So we may tell people to take action, and we assume that everybody will. But in some cultures, people will not take action unless the male head of household says what they're going to do. And so we need to tell people that, if they're in a location, they need to go now. And they need to go now regardless of the situation because this is what's going to happen, and try to overcome some of those barriers of people waiting on the male head of household to make a decision or being afraid of the government expressing messages to them. So there's a lot of different things that we have to do to try to overcome some of these cultural issues, and that means understanding what the cultural issues are in our communities. And there's a lot of good research on this. We've done a lot of research on why people don't evacuate, why people don't take shelter, and looked at it from different cultural dynamics. And so we can actually match our wording to try to overcome some of those barriers. Now, really want to show you some examples of wording that was not expressive enough in terms of the public understanding. This is the January 28th snow event in Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, and Atlanta. And one of the problems that we had is that the social media messaging as well as all the other warning messaging said we were going to get a dusting. And the word dusting has been heavily evaluated since then in terms of when we're trying to express it's not going to be very much, we call it a dusting. Well, this was a dusting of snow for sure, and the public's perception was it was not very serious, but in fact, the precipitation froze to the ground, that dusting melted, and froze to the ground and created this crazy event that led to this transportation nightmare. So now I hear a lot of meteorologists, a lot of broadcast mets saying they're going to be very careful in terms of the types of terminology that they use to try to make sure that they're not conveying less seriousness as well as too much seriousness. So I give that to you to think about every time you get into an event, how that wording could impact people's perceptions of seriousness and severity. There's another example of folks who thought they were going to get a dusting over in Atlanta. Now, to kind of conclude all of this, I want to talk about those cues to action. When we're doing our social media messaging, we have two opportunities, before the event, during the event. Before the event is the risk communication. So we have the opportunity to educate the public. We can push preparedness information out there, awareness information out there, advisory information out there to get the public more prepared for when the time comes. I follow a lot of weather sources, and they do a great job on risk communication, talking about things that we should be aware of, things that we should think of, things that we should do, things that we should look for. And so this is something that you're trying to convey in a very short and concise way. And so you want to build out that risk communication for different types of events, different seasons of the years. what kind of content could you build that would be very concise and educated? And there's a lot of good stuff out there already, so you can actually see what others have done. And I see a lot of people retweeting that information and pushing out the same kinds of information. And that's a good thing to do, too, because a lot of people already have those messages formulated. In terms of our crisis communication, in terms of social media, that's when the actual event is getting ready to occur and is occurring. So the tone and the seriousness of your message will be important. And tone in words is just as vital as somebody standing in front of a camera or coming across a radio. The tone of the written word can be very clear in your message. So you want to use words that convey seriousness. You want to talk about threats. You want to talk about impacts. You want the tone of the words you use to be different from what was in your risk communication, because you want them to see that you've switched from risk to crisis. You want to include those impacts. You want to talk about outlook information and lead time. So if you have information hours, days in advance, go ahead and push that out through social media and start capturing the public's attention. And I see that in social media all the time. The Weather Enterprise will send out information about the outlook saying, this is something we need to watch out for. This is something that may or may not transpire, but we want to be watching out for it. And then we get into lead time in terms of, okay, we're 24 hours out, we're 8 hours out, this is when we're expecting it. So it helps give people an idea of where they are on that timeline. And then there, of course, there are the exact watches and warnings, and I want you to be really careful with conveying watches and warnings because our watches and warnings are very complex. And so remember when you push those out to add wording to them to actually capture attention. And then finally, the calls to action. What is it you want them to do? And that may be the very first thing you put in the message. What is it you want them to do? Because if that's the only part of the message they get, they need to know the what. What do they need to do? Do they need to get into a shelter? Do they need to enact their emergency plan? What is it they need to do? What are you asking them to do? And then go on and explain in detail the rest of the information in the short amount of space that you have to convey that message. Also remember that a lot of folks are looking for visual cues and secondary confirmation, so your social media message may be that visual cue. If you can put a video in there, if you can put a picture in there, that shows them what it is, what it looks like, how big it is, what a beast it is. This is the tornadoes on April 27th. One of the things that we learned here was trying to get that information to the public in advance, got them to understand this was not your ordinary tornado day. We also know that people want that secondary confirmation. And so seeing in social media that a tornado has been confirmed, that damage has occurred, that gives them that secondary confirmation, and they're more likely to take action. So we want to include that in our messaging. And then also when you're creating your messages, you need to think about your publics and what kind of self-efficacy they have. What is their confidence in their ability to successfully perform what you're asking them to do? So, for example, if they have experience with previous events, your messaging can convey that. So Oklahoma, Moore, El Reno, those tornadoes, those environments have a lot of experience with tornadoes. So there's certain trigger words, certain information that's very common to that public because they know what they're supposed to do. They have shelters. They know how to act. So you can formulate your terminology because your environment is familiar. They may not have experience, though, with similar severity. Alabama in 2011, Alabama has experience with less severe tornadoes than they had in 2011. So when we start talking about EF4s and EF5s, our public here in Alabama doesn't understand what to do for a 4 or a 5. So our messaging has to convey this is more serious, this is more severe than what you've experienced before. What you would normally do may not suffice. And so then we give them additional advice because these are more powerful, these are stronger. And we got to remember because they don't have experience with it, it's important that it's in that message. Another thing we have to do in our social media messaging is realize that there may be enhanced fear that we did not anticipate. If the community has recently experienced an event, they're going to be more fearful. So what we would normally put in the messages, we have to overcome that fear. So with the El Reno tornado evacuation in 2013, they felt like they had to drive away. They were being told to drive away by a broadcast meteorologist. So in an event like that, we can try to reduce that fear. We can tell them not to do certain things that they might be panicking and doing. So we got to be real careful and understand how that can happen. Another example of that was Hurricane Rita in 2005, because Katrina had just occurred. A lot of people felt like they had to evacuate from Rita, and in fact they didn't. And so it created this huge transportation nightmare. So if we had had social media back then and been able to use it, we might have been able to reduce some of those impacts. So what's the psychology of all of this? People's perceptions of risk differ, and so we're going to have to overcome the mental noise from the stress and emotions that occur around events like this. We've got to increase the ability of people to hear the message. You can push it out there and they can receive the message, but they may not hear the message. And that's going to be based on trust, credibility, as well as those cultural factors I talked about. When I talk about culture, every one of us comes from different cultural backgrounds. And I'm not talking about race or ethnicity or where you're born or what your heritage is. We all have different characteristics based on who we are, young, old, northerners, southerners, mothers, fathers, children. All of us fulfill different roles culturally. And because of that, we perceive information differently. We understand things differently. So that's part of what you have to think about when you're pushing that information across. One message does not appeal to all. You're going to have to try different messaging. The same message could be done 10 different ways, and that would reach a broader audience. So you got to think about different ways to do that. To understand that, you got to understand that the public actually has what we call cognitive bias, which we can break down in terms of availability bias, optimism bias, and gambler's fallacy. Availability bias is the public says, I can imagine this happening, so it must be likely. Or I don't know the exact probability. And so what happens is they either underestimate or they overestimate, or they will draw on similar examples or experiences. That's why you'll have people think, I can ride out this hurricane because I rode out the last one. And they'll be the one who ends up dying in the current hurricane because it's worse than the one that they had survived, or they were just lucky in the previous one. There's also the effect of what we call the 9/11 effect, is that people overestimate and overprepare after a severe event. And so for a couple of years after a bad one, people are overly sensitized. So your messaging has to work through all of those things. People overestimating, underestimating, being overprepared, overly sensitized. All of those things can be a factor in that process. The goal, of course, is to get them prepared. And that's not an easy thing to do, and through social messaging, we can try it in a lot of different ways based on these biases that the public has. The other bias is optimism bias. You got to understand that when you're messaging that people typically always look on the bright side of life. They don't want our bad news. And that's about 80% of us. People will only marginally adjust when told it could happen to them, and fatalities will result from that optimism bias. People also overestimate the power of weather technology. So if you tell them something, they're going to assume that you have all the answers, you have all the knowledge. So remember, part of this is going to be the false alarm issue. It doesn't directly impact them. And so then they're going to start to question the content of our messaging because they overestimate the power of our ability to forecast weather. Then there's the gambler's fallacy. We must be due some good weather now. So if things have been bad, people are assuming it's going to get better. If the weather's already occurred, we must be due for a change. On April 27th, 2011, here in Tuscaloosa, we had tornadoes the morning of the 27th in the afternoon. We knew it was coming, and so when the ones happened in the morning, the general public, because of power outages and the lack of additional information, assumed it was over. They assumed if it had happened once, it was not going to happen again. And, of course, it did happen again later that day, much worse than what happened that morning. So we got to make sure that we're overcoming those fallacies. So how do we do that? Again, in our messaging, we need to do visualization. We got to show them where it's going to be, when it's going to be, how much it's going to be. We got to use colors. We got to use borders. There's a lot of information, and you can see just in this one graphic how much information we can convey. This is from Chicago's snow event last year, and you can see how much good information we could get across the message. And then we also want to make our warnings more vivid. You know about the impact-based warnings and the goal to try to achieve impact-based warnings. We want to get people to imagine what could happen. So that can be a big part of our messaging. Examples could be you could be killed if not underground or in a tornado shelter. Many well-built homes and businesses would be completely swept from their foundations. Mike Hudson from the Central Region says it paints a mental picture for people in the path of the storm. So think about how your message could convey that mental picture. Think about what it would be like in your mind, and then use the words, use the visualizations that help convey that message. Also simplify, make the risk more real. This is some stuff that's been used over in Europe and Britain, and basically trying to convey through social media very simple, tight information. It's a flood alert, a flood warning, severe flood warning. They're using colors, they're using pictures. And just look at the house in these three triangles. A little bit of water, a lot of water, and a whole lot of water. And look at what's happening to the house. So you can see we can get information across simply, and the goal is to make the risk more real. So in conclusion, what are we trying to do with our social media messaging? We're trying to navigate people's perceptions of risk. Remember, they don't want to change their behavior. They don't want to think it's happening to them. So we got to get them to understand their risk. We also have to understand that stress and emotion impact their perception. So when we're pushing this information out, they may be under so much stress and so upset, they're not hearing us very well. So we've got to understand their cognitive biases, and that's some of what I talked about today. We got to help them hear the message, and that comes down to trust and credibility in the messages that we put out all the time, not just during a severe weather event. It's part of risk communication and crisis communication that's ongoing. And then it's not just the Weather Service that's responsible for this. It's the whole Weather Enterprise Network. You guys are pushing information out through social media, but so is the whole Weather Enterprise. And so coordinating and partnering with your weather enterprise, your emergency managers, your broadcast meteorologists about risk communication going into different seasonal events, y'all can all be pushing out very similar information from different perspectives. You can be consistent in your messaging. You can, be connected in your messaging. So it's not just your responsibility. It's the whole responsibility of your enterprise networks. And engaging them in the social media process actually broadens the impact, strengthens the reach of your networks, and actually helps with the entire process. So that's it. That's everything I've got about social media messaging and how to make it more clear, how to make it more connected and intended. So I'll open it up now to your questions.
Very good, Dr. Laura. I really appreciate your taking the time to put all that together. That was some great information. And I know I personally am going to have to go back and watch this again and maybe again and again to pull out all the nuggets that were in there. One thing struck me as relevant when you talk about we as meteorologists send out a warning and we expect people to know what to do. I know that here in El Paso, about 10 years ago, we put out a tornado warning for the city of El Paso. And in my mind, growing up in the Midwest, I know what to do. But we put out a tornado warning, and we basically watched a town that has not a lot of experience with tornadoes just melt and just run like little mice all over the place trying to figure out where are my kids, what should I do? And this training would have really helped that we need to educate them. One question came up on Twitter is, should we continue the education process during the event, or should we try to educate people ahead of time?
Well, you should do it ahead of time, and you also should do it during the event. If you do it ahead of time, you reduce the potential of people to panic, just like the example you just gave. When, with no experience, they panicked, they ran around, they were doing all kinds of stuff. So if you educate them in advance, then they're less likely to panic, they're more likely to do what you expect them to do. But people still panic after the fact. So, for example, the El Reno tornadoes. With that particular event, people were doing things they'd never done before. Even National Weather Service personnel evacuated that event. And, I talked to them about it afterwards, and they said they knew better. So one of the recommendations that we made in the service assessment was you guys need to immediately after an event start educating again based on the fear coming from that previous event. So tell people what they did right and the things that they should change right after an event so that you're already starting to educate, because you don't know when that next event's coming. We were still recovering from the Moore event, so we weren't thinking about educating people. And right. So one of the recommendations is we start educating again immediately, because the next event could be a couple of hours the next day away.
Right. Very good. Okay, does anybody else have a question for Dr. Myers?
And then they thought, well, they took that as meaning the next.
I can hear somebody talking in the background, but does anyone have a question for Dr. Myers?
I have a question. Hi, Laura. Steve Mullins, WDTV. I understand your point about avoiding specific words, like you mentioned avoiding derechos, and I say, fine, okay, we can avoid that question. But it's harder to avoid things like freezing rain or winter weather advisory, because especially winter weather advisory is a product that we use. And I immediately want to start asking the question, is this more about we need to understand the public, or do we need to educate more? And I immediately also think, well, it's both. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it is both. And I spent all day yesterday at an integrated warning team in Atlanta where all the partners were actually looking at that. You know, do we do away with winter weather advisory, or do we educate the public about what the advisory is? Because we found out there that even parts of the weather enterprise didn't understand the definition of the winter weather advisory. And so that's the thing. You got to make sure everybody understands it. So if you're going to use the term, then you've got to educate your public as well as your partners about what those terms mean. But even then, you want to add a little bit to it. If you're going to use, you know, winter weather warning, winter weather advisory, whatever it is you're going to use, add some descriptive words to it. So like if you're going to use advisory and it's an upgrade, say this is an upgrade. This is more serious than the watch. So you just add a couple of more words to it to get people to trigger on what it is you're trying to get their attention, because they're going to make assumptions. And so if they assume it's less serious or they assume it's not important, it's gone.
This is Amy in Alaska with a follow-on question.
Okay.
Just kind of curious, would you foresee a social media post or entry that would not even have the word winter weather advisory for that particular example? For example, just not even focusing on what we use for the product name, but rather just focusing on what the impacts were, what the timing was.
Yes. And that's the thing, you know, if we're talking about trying to capture their attention and get them to take action, does the advisory get them to take action, or do the impacts get them to take action? And if you think the impacts is what your intent is, then that's what should be the content of it. And that doesn't mean you can't post all of it. You could put the warning, the advisory out, but also put additional messaging out with the actual impacts.
Very good. Any other questions for Dr. Myers? I've got a question for you. You know, as a research educational person at a university, it's real easy for you to take time to go out and ask the audience and do surveys. What's the best way you think for forecasters or WCMs to ask, you know, quote unquote, their audiences?
Best way to do that is through your partners, because your partners understand your public. And so in meetings with your partners, talk about these issues and say, okay, what makes the most sense? What terminology makes the most sense? Or what is most confusing to our public? When you guys do the integrated warning team meetings with your partners, I've seen a lot of it done there. Some of you do things that you don't call IWTs, but you have these meetings with your various partners, and you discuss these things. Like you'll have a previous event where the public didn't take appropriate action, and you'll talk about what went wrong. I did a meeting with one of the Southern Weather Service offices a couple of years ago about a hail event, and the public didn't understand the impacts of hail. And it was because the weather enterprise didn't understand how to convey the impacts of hail. And they were like, well, how do you do that? And I say, well, you know, think about what the public would understand. Do they understand what a tornado can do to them? Yes. All right. We'll turn that into what hail can do to them in terms of structures and physical harm. And they were like, oh, okay. And so we started talking about what their public would understand for a different type of event and applying it to another type of precipitation. So you can do that. Plus, you can also, you know, find it out from the research we've done. All of these service assessments, all of these studies that we've done, we've got a lot of common terminology that we know about. And we can actually help you with your community. You know, we'll be glad, you know, if any of you want to contact us about your particular community, and, you know, we can give you a little survey to do. We can actually run a survey for you. So if that would be of any assistance, just let me know.
Very good. I know we've gone a little past the top of the hour. Does anybody have any other questions? Well, very good. I know you packed a lot into your presentation, and I know a lot of people will have to go back and rewatch it like myself. We are recording it. Hopefully the recording will work out, but I will make both the recording and Dr. Meyer's slides available on the Google sites for the NW Think Social. I want to thank you, Dr. Myers, for taking the time out and giving us that great talk and exposing us to the best or better way to effectively use social media.
Sure, I really enjoyed it, and if I can answer any questions for anybody, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Yep, you can see her contact information there on the slide. If you drop her an email, like I said, we'll make all this available for you guys to go over. I'll make it available so you can share it with those people that were on shift or who are asleep right now. So again, thanks to everybody who joined us. And again, thanks to Dr. Myers, and everyone have a great day.